What if I'm just a bad person? And that's going to be the question of the video. Now, this is going to be a very chill talk about narrative voice. Not me specifically. It's about narrative voice, okay? Because we got some question to ask. Oh my gosh, look at him. Guys, look at him. He is an angel. And he is locked in. Anyway, I don't know how to frame this thing other than encouragement for you pursuing the reality of your characters. That's all this is. Before we get started though, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, like, share, subscribe. And number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. Number one way to be featured is through Leigh, the monthly prompt writing contest we did on Monday. Always the first Monday of the month, as much as I possibly can. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author with a book out or a book coming out. If you submit your cover and your first chapter, that chapter will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. And the third thing is if you would like to check out my books, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books. With that said, jumping into this. So there is a lot of discussion, and I've noticed an increase of this happening because, like, I've read 2 or 3 books in the last couple of weeks that have taken time out of the narrative to, like, pause and contradict something happening in the story just to tell the reader that, oh yeah, well, this is a bad thing, but like it was normal then, or to, tell you, well, the author knows that this is bad. It's just being included in this, but it's bad. There is a lot of discussion in general about, like, what types of characters you're allowed to have as protagonists, or if your character does something in a certain way, you're not allowed to have them as protagonists, or if your characters share a certain kind of opinion, even if they are an antagonist, they have to be like specifically disagreed with somehow, or else you are saying that you're giving that opinion validity. I generally use Dead End Drive as an example of this because people are totally fine with the murderers of Dead End Drive, but they're not okay with any of the isms in Dead End Drive. Like, they're all bad people, but people will excuse the murder, but not the racism. And then I know that there is conversation in a lot of writing groups or from people that say, if you have a character that has less than good opinions on something, you have to combat that in your narrative to prove that it is not your opinion. There's also this tendency to assume that a character, I don't know why it's always generally the negative opinions in a book, but that, like, the negative opinions do belong to the author, even if there are other negative opinions. It's like very specific negative opinions are obviously of the author. While authors do put things in their books that kind of give an example of, like, kind of let you into their hearts or their minds or how they view things, it is not always like one for one, but also when you start assuming that you have to correct people in text, you're now breaking the fourth wall in your story, and it actually makes it less believable. Now, that's not to say that you can't correct or conflict or contradict opinions in a story if they are bad opinions, but also that doesn't always happen, especially if they're the main character, especially if it is somebody retelling you things that have happened, and so you're not going to run into somebody else hearing those things. And this pressure to, like, pause the story to tell the reader that you are in fact a good person, so don't believe the characters, and that the characters fully believe in the stuff, is a ridiculous standard to set. So my personal philosophy or way that I approach fiction is the best way that I can describe it is summarized by Sanford Meisner, who was an actor, and he created the Meisner method of acting. And there's a famous quote by him about acting that is living truthfully in imaginary circumstances. And I apply that same thing to writing. If you want to write the best book that you possibly can, I think that you need to generally forget that the world exists outside of the book. You need to forget the audience. The only time the audience should come into your mental space is, one, for marketing, because you're trying to figure out who your audience is, and then two, to make sure that you are communicating what you're trying to communicate to the best of your abilities, because earlier drafts is you getting stuff out to get it out. So you have something to reference. The later drafts are making sure that you're communicating as effectively as you hope you are. At least that's how I see it. Obviously, everybody's got a different methodology and a different approach, but I think that when you start considering the audience's response too much, you're breaking the fourth wall, even just in conception, because all of a sudden you're going, oh no, I'm going to be called a racist because of this character. I'm going to be called a sexist because of this character. People are going to be mad at me for writing this thing, and I'm scared to write this thing because people are going to be mad at me. As soon as you're considering the responses of other people and you start holding yourself back from truthfully writing the situations because you're afraid of those responses, you're no longer able to write the stories truthfully. Because I think that you're then putting too much thought on how other people will respond. And I think this goes further than that. Like, it can be the bad opinions or the more sketchy characters. But I also think that it can happen because people are paying too much attention to like writing advice, or they don't want to receive super critical feedback. And so they avoid saying certain things or trying to avoid doing certain tropes because they've seen people get dragged or books get dragged for doing certain things. And they've got it in their heads not to do that thing because you don't want to end up on that show or with that opiner or with that reviewer dragging your book for doing that thing. And so then now it's just piling on the rules while considering an audience that you don't have yet for criticisms that you may never get. And so you're no longer living in the truth of your characters, the reality of your characters. And I think that is one of the most destructive things that you can do to your own writing, is sacrifice their truth, their reality to appease an audience that doesn't exist, that may never exist, that may never have an issue with your characters. On top of that, bad people can have opinions. Bad people have lives. Bad people have existences that may never be contradicted. Something that happens in a very large portion of the antagonist in American Princess is going to be Marcella's father, who does not agree with Marcella's decision to choose who she wants to marry, doesn't think that women should have that choice. And nobody's in that scene contradicting him, because it doesn't always happen like that. And sometimes you just have to live that way. If you look at Dead End Drive, especially the chapter between Doc and Alex, where they're going at each other, they're not contradicting each other. They're trying to freaking use what they can to get the upper hand on each other verbally. And they're not great people, but if you can excuse murder and you can't excuse bad opinions, there are questions there. There are other areas like and it can get really sketchy because of the interpretation of the stories. Like if you look at My Dark Vanessa, where the author got accused of romanticizing grooming to the point that she felt like she needed to say that her book was written off of her experiences so people would stop saying that she was romanticizing grooming. One, it didn't romanticize grooming. It was a depiction. It was a very good depiction of grooming. But if you're writing that situation truthfully from the truthful position of a 15-year-old girl who doesn't understand what is happening, then you're not going to be stepping back constantly to tell the reader, I know this is wrong. I know this is wrong, because you're living in the character who doesn't know. And the same thing is happening in The Shards from Bret Easton Ellis, where he is trading his body as a 17-year-old with some Hollywood people so he can get his chance to have a director look at a script that he was writing when he was 17, because that is so common. Or the same thing, and not even it's The Shards, but in Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero, when the main character, I can't remember its name, it's been so long since I read that book, and he's a high schooler from Hollywood, who has done drugs, always grown up in that area. He's got all of these trendy friends, and he walks in on his friends, or he's brought in by his friends because they're having a house party of some kind. And his friends have like this 10-year-old, 11-year-old girl tied up to a bed, and they're taking turns raping her. And they're like, hey, would you like a turn, dude? And he's like, nah. And then he walks out and leaves. And there is no commentary on anybody doing anything wrong, because you're dealing with the morality of that character, of the normalcy of that character and what they think is normal. And there's not a time in that character's head for them to pull themselves out and think, oh, wait, this is wrong. I mean, maybe it comes out at some point, but maybe it doesn't. There's the same thing if you look at the relationship between Ralph and Casey in Bodymore Zero. Ralph never pauses to say that the way Casey is treating him is wrong, because Ralph doesn't see it. And often you'll have these characters who grow up in these circumstances, who are used to being abused or are used to the circumstances they're grown up in, or are used to being treated a certain way, that they just don't even recognize what other people can recognize. So you can't just pause it and tell the audience, by the way, I know that this is wrong though, believe me. Another one is we need to talk about Kevin. And Eva in that book fully believes that this child that even when he was in her womb and he was not born yet, was evil and plotting against him. And part of her whole thing, her perspective is just her entire belief that this child is against her, is trying to punish her, is wanting to hurt her. And there's not going to be any point in there where this character is going to stop and recognize that she is wrong because she fully believes her perspective. And that is what people do. And if the author was afraid of how people would take the author themselves based on Eva's perspective, then you wouldn't have the truthfulness of that character. And again, there are just so many people I've talked to who are afraid of readers interpreting the characters as saying this is correct, though for some reason it's okay to mistreat children, and very few people will go after Eva for the way that she treats children, or Kevin, I should say. But that might just be because it's a great book. But that also leads to the fact that you need to be able to discuss an idea in a book without it being taken personally that you are discussing ideas in a book, especially as you present more outlandish ideas or more aggressive or offensive ideas. You should be allowed to talk about them in the same way, like in Werewolves Don't Die, and needing to talk about the presentation of the American Indian experience or culture in that book and what we're seeing as the character in that book. We have to be allowed to think this character has nasty thoughts. This character has nasty thoughts about his countrymen, about other people that he lives that he shares his life with, and no wonder he is aggressive. Because if you mark it off as you can't acknowledge this, or you have to praise this, or there's nobody in the book that says that it's bad. Like, there are different things where you can go, does this look like it is praising this thing, or is it not praising this thing? Which also becomes a very questionable, like, area, because you're like, well, the story is telling a story, so it's going to be positioning something, and the response all around will sort of inform the reader how they're going to take it. And that's also an area where it should be careful to accredit that to the author's feelings as well, because you're following a character. And I usually try to wait to see if I see the author saying agreement with stuff outside of the book that goes, yeah. Like I can talk about the book saying this is what the book is interpreted as saying to me without it being this is the author's beliefs. But it's when I see the author's stuff outside of the book that they're agreeing with the book that I'm like, that's less hidden. Amygdala is another example of there are many ideas in that book, especially since it is a political satire, a political drama. And it pretends to satirize how humans and animals are not that different. But even that idea itself, if it is a satire, then it is up for discussion. When you're writing satire, it is a spoof on things that we are familiar with, specifically to ridicule how things are. It's not a parody. I've had people tell me it's a parody. It's not a parody because parodies are specifically something that is derivative of something else. So like Weird Al songs that are like Eat It, where it's got a direct, or Scary Movie 1, where it's got a direct. Those are parodies. Satire is taking something, making it exaggerated for the point of making social commentary or for the point of entertainment. There's a bigger thing about what satire is, and I've actually done a whole video on satire, breaking down different types of satire. And Amygdala is a satire of society and of the political system. It calls itself a political drama and then takes them into the courtroom even. And so if you're going to present a satire and have these ideas in here, they're going to be discussed, saying, well, these are not human characters, so you can't put human morals on them, but then they're paying taxes and they have a court system. The fact that it is a satire puts it up for discussion. Now, whether or not you can say these are the beliefs of the author becomes a different thing. And you need, for me, I need different things to be like, and I've seen some of them, but you can still discuss the contents of the books, and the characters are allowed to be ugly. That's something that I think gets confused. Characters can be ugly and have ugly thoughts and believe ugly things and follow through on their ugly things and do those ugly, disgusting things with the full of their passion, and it not be related to somebody else's, I believe this. Another one that I want to mention for the ugly thoughts, is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, because there's an entire chapter in The Bluest Eye that is from the perspective of a pedophile, and he's talking about how he likes to taste and abuse little girls. And there is nobody in that book that interacts with this pedophile except for Pincola. And Pincola goes there and then thinks that he does some witchy thing on her because she wants blue eyes because she thinks her life will be better with blue eyes. And so she thinks that she's gotten blue eyes because then everybody is looking at her in this different way. From reading other perspectives, you get it that they're all looking at her in this special way because she was impregnated by her father and she's 9 years old, so everybody knows she was raped by her father. But there is nobody contradicting the pedophile's perspective and thinking about how saucy little girls are. Now, that doesn't go into what the author thinks is correct. You're writing a character, and the character is going to self-justify. You could say the same thing about Humbert, but Humbert has some level of like self-hatred where he goes, yeah, I'm a monster, but whatever. And that plays into anything. And the characters with the ugly thoughts may at some point confront themselves, may think themselves monsters, or they might not think themselves monsters, as many people don't. But it's okay to have your characters have ugly thoughts and never correct it in the narrative. That's what this rant is. And I'm sorry it's so disorganized. I could have put my thoughts together better. I'm just scatterbrained today, honestly. But I have run into books, 3 or 4 different books in the last couple of weeks that had been like, yeah, my dad believed this, and I'm just in the middle of the scene describing this thing, and like the men were out watching TV and the women were in the kitchen doing the dishes, because that's just how it is. It ain't right, but that's how it is. And it's like, just be in the moment. I don't care. I am not going to judge this character for believing this thing or doing this thing, and I don't need the author to pause the story, come out of the character, come out of the timeline to correct me to make sure I don't misinterpret the author's beliefs. And nobody else needs to do that. I want to encourage and empower anybody who is worried about the perceptions of their characters to write the situation as truthfully as possible, to just live in them, and to have the courage to write against the thoughts that other people might have bad thoughts about you because you wrote something and said somebody's going to accredit that to you. People think that Joey's bad opinions of the cops are my opinions of the cops, neglecting that there are 3 books in that series and Joey has a lot of her conceptions challenged. So some places, it's also interesting. So while we're also on the subject of like somebody having a negative thought or a bad opinion or a dangerous, toxic opinion or disgusting perspective or, straight up vile perspectives, like Celeste and I think Michael from Heather, and Celeste was from Tampa, and there was somebody else I was going to mention. But while talking about these people, one, Celeste's book tells me it's not a social commentary, or it didn't reach its social commentary desires because, one, you can find interviews of the author talking about the sexual explicitness being some sort of female empowerment, and it's very weird to try to do commenting on female on male pedophilia and predatory behavior while also saying that you're writing sexually for female empowerment, because then you're implying that open sexuality and open sexual behavior is part of female empowerment, but also this is somehow equal. It's not. You shouldn't mix feminism with predatory behavior on children. The other thing is the actions in the story don't quite add up to the ending. And it's very easy to say that when you're looking at like a mystery or a thriller where things are supposed to be set up and then you get to the ending, or with a romance when you see things set up and then it's like, okay, that's the obvious ending because when you see all of the pieces, even if you didn't connect it until the end. However, with this, when you're like, oh, nobody is acting the way that they should to get there, none of this makes sense. It's just a poorly written book, but then it's harder to opine on certain things because people look at the theme or the ascribed meaning of the book and then give it a higher rating because they're like, it has a good message or it's trying to do this thing. And hey, like what you like, but there are multiple ways to interpret things, and just why some people walk away saying, this I don't think said what it is claiming to try to say. Anyway, don't worry so much about being judged by what your characters do. Live truthfully in the moment. That is my suggestion that I highly recommend to everybody. Every single character in your book has a life of their own, living truthfully with the beliefs that they have, because if they didn't believe what they believe, then they wouldn't be doing the things that they do. And if you follow your characters through on what they believe, how they behave, all of these things, you will end up with fewer holes in personality, in actions, because they're following through with what they truly believe. And so then why would they cross themselves? Unless you have a good reason for them crossing themselves, because obviously even people with whatever morals will go against their morals sometimes because the situation calls for it. And now you're going to have to justify it. But it's going to make more sense because now you're living truthfully in those moments, in those constraints of those circumstances, and having to justify the availability of doing things and also the why they would cross it logically. It doesn't have to be rational. It does have to be logical. So, I don't know. End of the day, what I try to do on this channel, even though I have my own strong opinions about things, my opinions are just that. They're not objective rules. They're not objective statements of like what you have to do or else you're a bad person, or that you are a bad writer if you don't please me. I know that I'm very specific in what I like, as we all are, and I'm not the only person that exists. I just want to encourage discussion on writing and encourage courage in writing, encourage courage in art, to explore, to not let other people's opinions scare you off from being truthful in what you have to communicate through your art. And it's not always going to turn out well, and there is a level of skill that comes with learning how to temper what you're trying to say the correct way, but that's bigger than what this video is about, and it is a long-term skill and a long-term trial and error to application. So with that said, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Have you run into this thing where it's like the book stops to like finger wag at you to be like, no, this is wrong, don't do it? Have you ran into this weird thing of, oh, that's where I was going to go at too, is like you have people that'll jump on these things that don't make a comment on it for horrible opinions, but then you'll have all of these books that romanticize incest or rape or pedophilia, usually in the dark romance, crime, physical abuse, whatever. Have your fantasies. But those books specifically romanticize these things, and somehow it's fine. But then we're taking a different book more seriously and saying that it supports something. I don't know. There's just, I think that social media at some points is too much, that our brains aren't actually meant to handle this many opinions that are so different and can't make sense of it. And I want to encourage you, it's not that scary, and art is meant to communicate, and you can communicate good opinions, bad opinions, confronting them, not confronting them, just truthfully try to communicate the best that you can, the experiences that you imagine, and it will be fine. That's what I want to say. So let me know what your thoughts are on writing ugly opinions, reading ugly opinions, viewing ugly opinions, characters with ugly opinions or behaviors, never actually facing consequences if it makes sense to the story. And this idea, have you run into it, where it's like you have to stop and clarify that something is bad if it's put in your story, or else it's indicative of something else? Let me know. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
To my children, Tommy, Ike, and Annabelle, if you forget everything else I ever said in the lifetime we shared together, I need you to remember 3 things. 1. Minimize violence done to and by women. As givers of life, it's against their nature, God's design, to do harm, and every act of violence done to them is meant to break their souls, turning what should be a giver of hope into a black widow, a woman who destroys the life and the mercy of her care for no other reason but the corruption of her own self. It is only when you come across these kinds of women that you should put them down, for they are no better than the men who tarnished them. However, take no glee in what must be done. Finding any life so far gone, a black hole is where someone's heart should be, leaves only one solution: the mercy of death, and it's a tragedy when it happens. Make no mistake, a woman's love is the most powerful thing on this earth. It can start wars, end them, and change the devil himself into someone God sees worthy of giving a second chance. She don't owe this love to anyone, but she do carry it around with her so long as she's living. That is why the devil will do everything he can to pervert women's nature and destroy their innocence. Of every crime you can commit during your lifetime, be it out of daring or necessity, for every defiance you may act out against God, government, or man, avoid harming the innocent, for the day that we become bloodthirsty beasts where love don't exist anymore is the day hell on earth has come. And as bad as it may seem at times nowadays, we ain't there yet. 2. Everything you do in your life will create consequences, both seen and unseen, extending further than you can imagine. Nothing you do exists solely within your arm's reach. Think about every decision you make, every action you take, because you won't know how long your choices will stalk you, be them destructions or blessings, rumors or history been made. The truth of the matter is, your life will be controlled not by the truth of what you've done, but by the way others carry on about you. And the thoughts of others are more real in the long term than what you know to be true. It won't stop affecting you just 'cause it ain't real, and no matter the life you've lived, most men can't outrun what's written in them in ink. It ain't hopeless, though. Be firm in knowing who you are outside of the noise, and live beyond the means of the news of the day. 3. There ain't anything stronger than a family you build for yourself. What you put together is worth fighting for. Protect your loved ones with your life, and they'll give theirs in return. Family ain't defined by blood, understand that. And for as strong as the bonds of your family are, know that you'll find just as much passion in the people who hate you. While you'll risk your life for those you care about, those who find your existence to be an insult to theirs will risk themselves to put an end to their affliction. As cruel as it may seem, a man who hates you will stop at nothing until one of you is dead. It's a mistake to believe anything different. Don't let you be the ones taken from, be it by outlaw lawmen or by someone in between. The only one who'll be looking out for you is you and your kin. Maybe there's another way to be, but in all my years I've seen the worst of man, I ain't found another way around man's desire to conquer against all else. There ain't a changing of that mind, and sometimes I believe there ain't the ability for man to change at all, least of all through lead or legislation. I ain't claiming to be right about nothing. On many things, I don't want to be right. But what I do want is for my kids to live a better life than the one I did and avoid the mistakes that I made while finding the truth and purpose in what matter more than gold in this country. It's my hope that by sharing the things I learned that my kids will be better than their old man ever was, and that what I done isn't what people remember me for, but who y'all are going to become. That'll be the legend of Bill Cassidy.